Today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pauline Rabin. She's a relatively new member to our Temple community, and she's lived an exciting life. She was born in South Africa, and she spent time not only growing up in South Africa, but time in Israel and time in the United States. So we're looking forward to hearing about all of her exciting adventures. Pauline?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you will enjoy my travels from South Africa to England, then to America, and then to Israel, and then back to America. So I've put in a lot of mileage. I'll start by telling you about what it was like growing up in South Africa. I was born in Johannesburg, which is a very big city. I hear it's much bigger now, but it was a big city then. And I went to school there, and I went to medical school there. And I did my internship in internal medicine in South Africa. What I learned from my experience in South Africa is that not all men are born equal. And that distressed me more and more as I grew up, and especially when I started practicing medicine. In medical school, we were sent out to various little settlements where Africans lived, and we were given a wonderful clinical experience because the Africans were very native and very unsophisticated and knew nothing about medicine. But we were exposed to the conditions under which they lived. And when I did it was a medical school rotation in obstetrics, we sat around until a phone call came in, and then we would go with someone who knew the vicinity, and he or she would take us to the person's house. It was very primitive, but the people were usually delighted that we came. I found out later they were delighted that we came because this way their child could be registered. Otherwise, the child wasn't registered. Anyway, they were very nice to us, but it was a little frightening to be in this little hovel alone with a lot of black people and a woman who had just given birth. We saw a lot of malnutrition, and most of the little children that were running around had big bellies and were quite malnourished. I didn't think this was very fair, and I started thinking about leaving South Africa. I need to tell you that when I was born, the government was a general government and more English. But in 1948, the nationalists came in, and they were Fabrenta nationalists. And they insisted on enforcing the apartheid, and they did enforce it. And you all know the word apartheid, I'm sure. But it meant separate and not equal. And that was the most disturbing thing to me. The education was not equal, and the salaries were not equal, and the black people did whatever they could to find work. In South Africa, every white family had at least one black servant. Some had 2 and some had 3. You had a girl who was 45 or something, who was in the house, and you had a boy who was anywhere, any age, but usually older, who did the garden work and cleaned the yard and did the heavy cleaning. And then some people had extra servants. If they had a large garden, they'd have another person. And where did all these people stay, the black people? They stayed in little houses. To call them a house is a euphemism. They stayed in rooms in the back of the property. So you had your house and your nice garden, a front garden and a back garden, and the back of the back garden was a room in which a servant would live. And the servants were on call all the time. They'd have some days off, not a whole day, as I remember. They'd have Sunday afternoon or Sunday mornings off, and usually Thursday afternoons off. And they were expected to babysit at night if the family needed them. So they didn't have hours. They were at your beck and call. That's how I remember it. I'd be interested in if other South Africans have other memories, but that's how I remember it. It was very, very unfair, unequal, and exploitative. My father was born in Lithuania and came to South Africa at the brave age of 13 after his bar mitzvah. He came alone, although some other people were apparently traveling at the same time. And the only thing he was told, you must take a boat from London that says, not U.S., Union of South Africa. It must say Union of South Africa. There must be a little word after Union. Whereas if you were going to the United States, it would say United States of America. So my father, all he knew of English was there was a little word of, and he had to look out for that of. Anyway, he was a very bright man, but he got to South Africa. Why did he come? Because his father was there. His father had been a rabbi, and his mother had married him because he was a rabbi. She was very orthodox, but he wasn't as orthodox. And he came to America, and she said she would never join him there because the people were heretics. And so he went to South Africa, and she decided to join him there with all the religious Jews. There weren't that many, but she had the idea that there were. Anyway, so he came out to South Africa and then joined his father. He was a more socialist kind of person and liked to see things being fair. And he agreed with me that life in South Africa was not fair, but he said it's much better than in Lithuania because they don't try to kill the Jews. And he had left, he was glad to leave Lithuania because there'd been a pogrom. And I've never been in a pogrom, but I've read about them and they're not too comfortable. Anyway, my mother, however, was born in South Africa, and she was more accepting of the situation, that the blacks were servants and that the whites were educated and had good jobs. But I got my feelings of the unfairness of it all from my dad. Anyway, medical school only reinforced that. And when I saw the way black people lived, I felt it was really very unfair. I did have a few Afrikaans friends. The Afrikaners were the nationalists, And I spoke to some of them. Some of them were doctors that I met after I graduated when I was doing an internship. And they couldn't see anything wrong with it. They said that I was a communist. Anyway, I married in my final year of medical school, and my husband felt very much the same way as I did. And we decided we were going to leave because there was very little we could do. Some whites have stayed on in South Africa and have done something and did agitate, but it was a long way from 48 to the first black president in 1994. It's a long time till Mandela became the president. Mandela was a wonderful man. I followed him quite assiduously, and I knew his wife. I didn't know him, but I'd met his wife, Miriam Makeba. But she went off the rails when he was in jail. You know, he was imprisoned for years on Robben Island. And what did he do there? He chopped stones for no reason other than giving him work to do. But he retained his dignity. He was a wonderful man. He's still alive. He is one of my heroes. I think he's an unusual man. And without him, there would have been a bloody revolution in South Africa. I really believe that. Anyway, after we left South Africa, we went to London. We went by boat, my husband and I and a little boy, and there were some other classmates who were also leaving to go to London. The ostensible reason for leaving was that there was no postgraduate education in South Africa. They do have it now, but they didn't have it then. And we went to London so that my husband, who was an unusually brilliant young man, could do his MRCP and MRCPE. That stands for Member of the Royal College of Physicians of London and the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. Well, we thought we'd have to stay there for a long time for him to pass, but he passed them both right off the bat, and he worked in a hospital in London. And just as we were finishing that year, which was expected, we got a call from a friend in Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And he asked if we'd like to come. There were fellowships available. Now, my year in London was spent as a locum tenens, which means in place of. If doctors would take off an afternoon, they would have to have someone to cover. And they had a list of people, and I was one of the people on the list. Well, this meant that I had to drive around London. Now, I had no clue, and there was no GPS. So I had to buy, they told me to buy this book of London, a big book, every page detailed with addresses. And I'd drive around. I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And I'd go into some of the crummiest places in London and some relatively nice places. One story stands out in my mind. When I asked this man to undress, he said, "My doctor never asks me to undress. Why should you?" I said, "I don't know how to examine you." He said, "You'll have to do the best you can. I'm not undressing." Anyway, it was a fairly respectable practice. I was amazed that Because we in South Africa always thought that English doctors were the best, because they were our role models. Anyway, I went into quite a lot of different houses, climbed a lot of steps, and saw a lot of clinical medicine, and learnt a lot there. At the end of the year, I was ready to give that up, and my husband was ready to go to America, and my little boy, who was he was 2 then, he was ready to go to America. So we went to America. We went on a very lovely boat called the Empress of England or something. And it was a lovely boat. And we arrived, I was sick as a dog. Even though they said there were stabilizers and it was a safe boat, but I was so sick. I took one look at the ship's doctor and said, I don't want him. I was pregnant. I don't want him to deliver my baby. So I held on to my baby until we came to America. We docked in New York, and a very good friend of my husband's met us there, and we went by train to Baltimore, which was where the fellowship was. I was able to get, after my baby was born, a few months later, I was able to get a fellowship in the same program. Although my husband concentrated on endocrinology, I concentrated on general medicine. So we spent several years in Baltimore, which was a very pleasant town, and had a very nice Jewish community, and we liked it there until the 6-Day War came. And then I became really aching to go to Israel. I felt the war was unfair. Again, unfair, I'm always worried about fairness. We went to Israel in 1968, after the war. And I've never regretted that. I learned to speak Hebrew. I'm fluent in Hebrew. And I enjoyed it there, except for problems that were there. The people were kind of aggressive and pushy. And you're all laughing. You've had experience with that. But they were good people, but they were pushy. And my husband wanted to continue doing clinical research, which was at home in America. And so we went back to America after we'd been there for almost 6 years. I really was sad to leave Israel, but I was glad to come back here. Oh, by the way, in the meantime, I'd specialized in psychiatry. When I was at Hopkins, there was a new fellowship. It was for people who were doctors who had never done psychiatry. They were trying to attract people into psychiatry. And I was one of the first fellows. And I was recommended by my boss, who was Eugene Meyer. His father was the man who started the Washington Post. And then his sister took over. And then his brother-in-law took over, or vice versa, I don't remember. He didn't consider himself a Jew, but he was very partial to Jews. Anyway, he recommended me for the fellowship, which I got, and I stayed on in psychiatry because it started to seem, it seemed to me more fair. I'm just saying that as a joke because I saw a lot of people in internal medicine whom I couldn't understand what was going on. They were very uncomfortable, very upset, very symptomatic, but they were not medically sick. And I learned in the fellowship that they had some psychiatric problems. A lot of them had depression. And I learned how to work with that. When we got back to the States, my children were really quite grown. My youngest two went to school in the States. My son graduated from the University of Chicago and went on to Harvard, and he is now a business, what does he call it? Investment banker. I don't think that's so fair. But anyway. But he's doing very well, and he has two children. My daughter is a writer, the oldest daughter is a writer for the New York Times. She writes for the health section. And my younger daughter, third daughter, I have three daughters. My second daughter is a history professor at the University of Illinois. And my youngest daughter is a physician, a psychiatrist. And when I tried to discourage her from that, she said, I loved sitting at the table and hearing the stories you told. Anyway, she's quite a good psychiatrist. She teaches at the medical school in Maine. Anyway, that's what happened to my children. I continued in psychiatry until 2005. I retired and have worked in clinics occasionally, but I'm now fully retired. And I think that's fair. After a lifetime of working. And that's my story. I'll gladly take questions. Yes?
How did you end up in Sarasota?
Oh, we were in Maryland, and the cold, the snow. My husband, I remarried after my first husband died, and I remarried this nice man here, and he doesn't like the cold, and nor do I, so we came down here.
With your multilingual background, what language was in your home when you were a child growing
English.
up?
In South Africa, you could choose.
What could you choose?
English or Afrikaans?
Afrikaans. What was taught in the grade schools?
English. You'd go to a school of your home language. So my home language was English. I could go to an English-speaking school. But I had to graduate with Afrikaans as one of my subjects.
And in medical school, what language?
English.
Was there any Afrikaans taught in medical school? Or
No.
used? None at all?
No.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
What did it mean to have a child registered? Well, you said, by having a doctor available.
They could get a birth certificate. Because otherwise they couldn't.
And that would lead to what? Having a birth certificate?
Well, it would lead to a better chance of getting a job. Yeah.
Can you describe what the Jewish life was while you were living in South Africa?
Yeah.
Community-wise? Can you describe Jewish life while you were young living in South Africa?
Well, it was quite active actually. Most of the synagogues were Orthodox. Reform came in much later. When I was leaving, they started having some Reform synagogues. And conservative, I don't know if they have got it yet. I don't know. But it was, my father was a Gaba. He was a big macha in the shul, and he organized a lot of the Jewish activities.
I was under the impression that when the Reform Jews did come to South Africa, that they were much more liberal and favorable toward the Afrikaners or toward the black community. Is that so?
I didn't hear you.
When the Reform Jews came to South Africa,
Yes.
were they more liberal and understanding of the black people who lived there?
Of the black people? Probably.
People were not Jewish.
It was also about the time.
Yeah.
When they first came, that's what I was taught.
Yeah. Yes.
Way back at the beginning of your story, you talked about going out to the villages and seeing young kids, and you referred to them as African. Did you not think of yourself as being African? Did you think of yourself as being English?
No, I didn't think of myself. None of us did think of ourselves as being Africans.
Okay. And second is a political question, if I may.
Yes.
How did we end up in a situation where South Africa is so hostile to things Jewish and Israeli today?
How did we?
End up in the situation that South Africa is so hostile to things Jewish and Israeli in today's world?
Well, I really don't know how that evolved, but at one time Israel was very much involved in South Africa, was helping them with a lot of things, and why they've become anti-Israel, I suppose it's this boycott thing that's going around. BDS.
Oh, I'm very familiar.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they have to participate.
I don't know why they are.
Okay.
They've forgotten their history.
Was Yiddish spoken in the community?
Yiddish?
Yes.
Well, a lot of the immigrants to South Africa, the Jewish immigrants, were from Lithuania. As a matter of fact, almost all were from Lithuania, and not so after the war. After the war, we got Jews from all over the world. But there was a lot of Yiddish spoken. My father spoke Yiddish, my mother knew Yiddish, and they spoke Yiddish at home when they didn't want us to know what was said. Yes.
Do you still have family in South Africa?
I don't, but my late husband does. And as a matter of fact, my daughter, oldest daughter, is there now visiting them, and she's having a grand time. They're so excited to see her, but none of my side of the family lives in South Africa. A lot went to Israel, and a lot went to Australia. Why Australia? Because they spoke English and they needed people. In general, all the Lithuanian Jews were very Zionistic. My father was a Fabrenta Zionist, and that's why I landed up in Israel.
Do you have siblings?
I have a sister, and she lives in Israel. She lives on a kibbutz. She's been there since 1956. And she lives on a kibbutz in Israel.
Where the Afrikaans, are they originally from Germany and Holland?
No, they're not from Germany. They're from Holland and France. They left because of religious persecution. And they came to South Africa, and they could do what they liked.
Because I lived for nearly a year in Rhodesia.
Oh.
Yes. And there were lots of Afrikaans. And I felt the Afrikaans were very anti-Jewish. And I was always very careful not to mention I was.
I don't think they were all anti-Jewish, but
Maybe
some
not,
were.
But they show the feeling against Israel, and
Yeah.
yeah, they like that. And I love South Africa. I love Cape Town most of all.
Oh, it's a beautiful city.
Magnificent city.
The whole country is really quite beautiful.
Yeah, but Cape Town reminds me like Haifa because of the mountain.
Oh,
right in the
yes.
center, and it's just like Mount Carmel.
It
looking
is
down
a
to the
lot
sea.
like Haifa.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah,
The mountains coming out of the sea.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
yeah, beautiful. Yes.
One other thing, is the weather in South Africa is wonderful. You don't get much snow, you don't get much winter. It's a very moderate climate. That's what I missed when I came here. I think that lady had asked a question first.
On a more personal note, being from Baltimore, did you belong to a temple in Baltimore?
Yes.
What?
What
Was it Reformed or conservative?
We went first to a Orthodox, and it was too Orthodox for us, so we went to a conservative. He's a communa.
Is it Communa? I lived around the corner.
Oh, did you?
Yes. Where did you live in Baltimore?
We lived in
Mount Washington.
huh?
Mount Washington.
Mount Washington.
We were neighbors.
Hi, neighbor. What street did you live on?
No, well, I lived in off of Pimlico Road, Pimlico Drive, which was about a mile or so from Mount Washington.
Yeah.
And then I lived on the other side of that when I was younger. And we belonged to Bethel,
Oh.
where Rabbi Mishkin actually came from.
Oh.
He was an associate rabbi there.
I didn't know that.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Everybody learned something.
Someone else had a question?
I was going to, from my memory, I was under the impression that South Africa was very advanced in heart surgery with Christian Barnard, the
head
doctor.
doctor.
And that's why I was surprised when you said that they didn't have very much after graduation for the.
Oh, they do now.
Postgraduate.
Oh, they do now. But at that time, which I'm talking about was 1957, they did not have any postgraduate degrees or training. But they do now.
Are they equivalent with all the other countries, would you say now?
I really can't say. But I'll tell you, the clinical experience we had was the richest in the world, because we had hands-on on everything. I don't know that it was fair to the blacks to let the students make so many decisions, but they did.
Is the AIDS under control in South Africa, or are they still having all that trouble with the
I can't hear you.
Is AIDS under control in South Africa
No,
today?
no,
'Cause
it's not.
It's rampant throughout Africa as a whole.
Yeah, it's rampant
And I just
in
wondered
South
if they were
Africa.
ahead.
Answer is no.
You cited the fact we think it's under control.
Any other questions? I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank Dr. Rabin for her fascinating talk. And again, I want to welcome everyone to join us on August 1st to Huron Pine.